talk Polina Pullover. So I decided to knit this off gauge for slightly different reasons than I normally decide to knit things off gauge. I've already mentioned that the kind of ball band suggested gauge for the yarn that I'm using, the Briggs & Little Sport, is 24 stitches for 4 inches or 10 centimeters. That is the gauge that the Polina Pullover calls for. And the reason that I decided to knit it off gauge is not so much that I knew that I would be unhappy with the fabric, though it is a woolen spun yarn, which means that I have a bit more leeway in either direction, so knitting it tighter has not proven to be a problem, and that's very fortunate. The reason, though, that I decided to knit this off gauge is because of the gaps in the sizes, and just kind of the range of the range is quite good, but the iteration of sizes available. So I'm going to give you some of my body dimensions, and Teddy Litzak, I think quite helpfully, shares some of her body dimensions. But just when we're talking about bodies and sizing, I think that the knitting community seems to have made good strides in terms of body positivity over the last few years, and hopefully this is a community that is quite good at thinking about these things. But because we're going to be talking about bodies, and this is something that's definitely on my mind, I wanted to share that I am smaller than I have ever been before right now, and I think that we're moving away from thinking about that as an exclusively positive thing, but we're still not, we're still imperfect, we still have a ways to go, and so I just wanted to share before I give any of my dimensions or talk about the fit of sweaters on me that, it's not a great thing that I'm smaller than I've ever been. I'm definitely underweight at the moment, and it is because of ill health and is contributing to ill health. So I'm all right. I don't say that because I want to, I don't know, but I just, feel like we're hopefully getting better at balancing out positivity about health and bigger bodies, but I think that it's important to note that across the board, weight is just not a marker of health. You can't tell how healthy someone is by looking at them. So I have a 36-inch bust, and I mentioned, I think earlier, that I am above average height. I'm 5'8". So those are kind of my main dimensions. And Teddy Litzak has a 33-inch bust, and very helpfully, actually, in this case, I won't talk about this until a little bit later, but she's also shared that she is 160 centimeters or 5'3". So quite a bit smaller than I am, which is not something that I didn't consider height. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the reason that I share my bust dimension right off the bat is because this pattern has quite a large motif. Here is just some of the motif. This is just the first 2 leaves. In fact, why am I holding that up? I can show you the whole motif, right? So by the time we get down to the second set of leaves, that's quite a sizable, that's quite a chunk, and the pattern changes its sizes based on adding 1 iteration of the motif each time. So that's why there are quite big gaps between the sizes. Again, I mentioned this last time, I absolutely don't mean this as a criticism of the pattern. I think this is the nature of the pattern, but it presents certain challenges and means that some of the sizing might not work exactly the way that we want it to for, our specific bodies. So I'm looking at usually the bottom end of the sizing. So the first size that Teddy Litzak makes available is a 38-inch bust. And the next size up after that is 44¼ inches. And the guidance that she gives for recommended positive ease is 4 to 6 inches. So at a 36-inch bust, that puts me in my sweater should fit, according to her guidance for positive ease, between 40 and 42 inches. But that size doesn't exist for me. There's either the 38, which would give me 2 inches of positive ease, or the 44¼ which would give me over 8 inches of positive ease. Now, I also have my own preferences for positive ease. I wore this sweater in part because This is a sweater I'm really happy with the fit of. This is the Autumn Alpine by Caitlin Hunter, and this came out to about 39 and a quarter inches at the bust. And I'm really happy with that. So that's a sweater dimension that I know that I would be happy to wear. Another circular yoke colorwork sweater that I'm very happy with is my Bighorn sweater, and that came out at almost exactly 40 inches at the bust. So these are things that I think about when I'm planning to knit a new garment and thinking about where I would like the sweater to fit in terms of some of my sweaters fit me a bit more snugly, some a bit more loosely. I know that some people feel really strong, they've found the amount of positive ease that they're happy with, and they want to knit all of their sweaters to that positive ease, so that's something to consider here. I'm very happy to have a range of positive ease, but I do have preferences within that. So, the 38-inch bust sweater, size 1 here, would be possible for me, and could be a good option, but there are a few reasons that I decided not to do that. The first is that I would really like the sweater to have a bit more positive ease than that. 2 inches isn't very much. And the second reason is that I know that I am a tight knitter. The fact that this yarn suggests 24 stitches for 10 centimeters or 4 inches means that I would probably be happy with that fabric, but before I've cast on, I can't be certain of that, and my preference tends to go denser. So it's possible that even if I plan to knit the 38-inch sweater, the gauge I would be happy with would be quite a bit smaller, and I definitely don't want a sweater that's smaller than 38 inches. Not in this case, not the way that this sweater fits, and the way that I'm envisioning it, and what I plan to wear it with, and all of that jazz. I want it to be bigger than 38 inches. So I'm a bit hesitant about size 1 to start with. On the other hand, 44 and a quarter inches is way bigger than I want it to be. That is too much positive ease, and it's going to end up being a sweater that fits very differently than the sample fits on Teddy Litzak. And I quite like the way that it fits on Teddy Litzak. So already, right off the bat, I'm thinking size 1 is too small. It's going to risk being way too small with my tight knitting. Size 2, way too big. So what I would normally be doing is knitting a little bit off gauge, probably, and smaller. But what I'm going to do, even what I've decided, even before I've started casting on, even before I've knitted any swatches, is I know that I'm going to knit size 2, but probably quite far off gauge. Size 2 at a tighter gauge. Now, there are some other things that I could do, and that you might want to do in a situation like this. If this sweater did not have color work on the torso and on the sleeves after the split for sleeves, it might have been a different story. If that was the case, I might have decided to knit size 1 and instead figured out what my gauge was and how much bigger I wanted the sweater to be than what I was going to end up with. And I might have added in just a couple of stitches between the different motif repeats. And that might have been enough to get me a sweater that I would be very happy with. The problem with doing that in the case of the Polina Pullover is that if you interrupt the predicted stitch gauge up here, the stitch gauge isn't going to work on the torso or on the arms, so you're also going to have to make modifications that become increasingly more complicated farther on down the sweater. So that could have been an option, but in this case I just didn't want the headache, and I quite like the density of the motifs, so that's not a super useful modification in this case, though it might be in other cases. Another thing that I might have done, and in fact that I think I would do if I was planning to knit the Polina Pullover again, would be to use a different weight of yarn. I almost always knit my garments at a tighter gauge than is what is called for in the pattern, but I think that this would actually be a really interesting case to use a DK weight yarn, like the Jacob, and knit it at 22 stitches per 4 inches or 10 centimeters instead of at 24. And then you could knit a size smaller than what you want. So I could knit the 38-inch sweater and end up with a bigger garment than that. So that's another interesting option, and I think would be a path of less resistance in this case, because it would be moving off gauge slightly less than what I'm planning to do, which means fewer complications, fewer unforeseen challenges, things like that. But A, I don't have enough of this to make another sweater, and B, I was, you know, the colors, I was already pretty committed to this yarn by the time I got to this stage of planning, and had really fallen in love with the idea of a green Polina pullover. So these are options that could be considered in other cases that I think are also good ways to approach getting the fit that you want, especially if, you know, we're talking about a garment that has big gaps between the sizes. But in this case I decided to be stubborn and stick with the yarn and the motif arrangement the way that it is. Right, so at this stage I've decided that I want to knit the sweater off gauge, and I've decided which way I want to go, whether I'm going tighter or looser, in this case tighter. I've also decided what size I'm going to knit. So in the case of the Polina pullover, I'm going to be knitting size 2, and I'm going to be knitting it smaller, at a smaller gauge than the pattern calls for. What do I do next? My general procedure when I've gotten to this stage and I'm really starting to plan to swatch and, you know, at this point you want to cast on, right? So the first thing that I do is I look at the yarn requirements for a size 2, and I make sure that I have at least that much yarn. At least as much yarn as the size that I'm planning to knit, even though that garment will be coming out quite a bit smaller than that predicted size. Even though the size 2 will be coming out for me, hopefully, quite a bit smaller than 44¼ inches, I want to make sure that I have as much yarn as size 2 calls for. I am conservative in almost nothing in my life, except for in terms of yarn requirements. I find playing yarn chicken really stressful, and I am tall. So I like to have even a bit of buffer on top of that size. How much buffer you want to have will you know, depend on you. Yarn requirements are never an exact science, so I'm sure that you all already have, you know, your preferences and comfort zones for this already mapped out. But that's just something to keep in mind, is you want to be aiming for kind of the upper limit of the size range that you're looking at, right? I'm hoping that my sweater will end up somewhere between 38 inches and 44¼ inches at this stage. I haven't done any math, so I don't know exactly where I'll land in that range, but I want to look at the yarn requirements for the upper limit of that range. Step 2 is choosing a needle to actually do the swatching with. And this is again something that will be quite personal and that you'll get a feel for. I have learned that for me, and obviously every designer is different in terms of their tension, but for me, I tend to hit gauge by going up a full millimeter or even 1.5 millimeters on most people's gauges. But I tend to be happiest with a fabric where I'm using a needle that's just 0.5 millimeter up from what the pattern is calling for. I feel like that's quite confusing to just say out loud like that, so let's turn back to the Polina pullover for an example. The Polina pullover calls for a 3.5 millimeter needle, so normally my best guess for what's going to make me happy in terms of fabric would be to use a 4 millimeter needle. That would typically give me a gauge that is smaller than the pattern's gauge, but I like the fabric and it's still going up a bit of a needle size. In this case I've done something a bit different because I know that I want to be quite a bit smaller than 44¼ inches. I'm not just aiming for a fabric that I'm happy with here, I'm also aiming to make a smaller garment. So in this case I actually swatched, it's a bit of a dark yarn, but I actually swatched with both a 3.5 millimeter needle, so the needle called for in the pattern, and my standard 0.5 millimeter needle up. When I am swatching for something where I really am not sure what kind of gauge I want to use or what's going to give me a fabric that I'm happy with, this is pretty standard practice for me to swatch with 2 needles, so I just grabbed some of my other swatches to show you. This is some initial swatching that I did before I knit my bighorn sweater, so again using 2 needles. You can tell I, was going to be doing a lot more math for that sweater since I was designing it from scratch, so I made myself slightly bigger swatches. This is not best practice in terms of swatching. This is really too small. It's not giving enough space to get a really accurate view on gauge, but I'm not aiming for best practice. I'm not going to turn around and be upset with anyone if this doesn't work out. I'm accepting responsibility for some wiggle room and things being a bit more complicated. And it's what works for me and what I can get myself to do, right? I think that's sometimes the most important thing with swatching is what are you going to be able to get yourself to do and what results will you be okay with. So this was in the Jacob DK. That's another swatch I did that way. I have 2 in Polina. I did a swatch for the sweater that I knit myself last year and the sweater that I knit my mum. I swatched for both because the different colors of yarn can sometimes, the different color treatments, different batches, they can knit up at quite different gauges. So I did that for both of those. Again, quite small, but just enough to get me going, to give me a ballpark. And this is some Estelle Eco Shetland for a garment that I haven't actually knit yet. I need to go back to this, but this again, it's a bit harder to see because it's knit in a texture, but I knit in the texture that they're calling for, but this is a Sylvia Watts cherry pattern that I'm knitting this up for. So knit in the texture that she says you need to check your gauge for, but again on 2 different needles. So that can be a place to start and gives you an idea of fabric at least. That, in this case, told me that the 3.5mm needle was going to be too small. I'll talk about the math in just a few minutes. So next I swatched with, which one was which? I swatched with a 4mm needle, and I also swatched with a 3.25mm needle because I still wasn't totally happy. So I did, these are a bit more accurate. You'll notice I swatched flat for those, which is again, not best practice. If you're knitting in the round, you want to knit your swatch in the round. I did that in this case, and that gave me a lot more information. So once I was settling on a fabric that I was happy with, and all of these things, I'm doing the math to figure out exactly which of these swatches is giving me a fabric and a projected sweater that I'm happy with. And that is the end of the procedure, unless you're still not happy and then you just need to repeat, right? So repeat using a different needle, do the math again, and keep doing that, keep swatching and keep doing the math until you have a needle and gauge and fabric and projected sweater that is the best of all worlds, hopefully.